The rain came down sideways that night, cold, mean, and snapping against the diner's neon. People ducked in like they were trying to outrun their own shadows. At a corner booth under a flickering open sign sat Jake, 40-ish, schlubby jacket, coffee gone cold, and a paper bag of takeout he couldn't be bothered to pick at. He looked like a dude who'd been run through a couple hard winters without a single sweater to show for it. Single dad? Yup. Exhausted? Double yup. Before we continue, please tell us, where in the world are you tunning in form? We love seeing how far our stories travel. We love you to subscribe our channel for more interesting single dad stories. Across from him, his little boy Max was doodling superheroes on a napkin while a half-eaten grilled cheese went neglected. They were quiet in that way people get when their silence has a story. A rent notice, a busted truck, a job that slipped out of reach. Jake's hand hovered over the napkin like he was about to scratch an idea into existence and didn't know what to write. That's when she appeared, small as a whisper and twice as bold. She shuffled up, one leg missing below the knee and a backpack slung over the other shoulder. She looked like every kid you'd see in line at a hospital, eyes tired but teeth straight, hands that had learned responsibility too young. She asked, politely, like she was rehearsed, "Can I share your table?" Her voice had that quiet resilience you only hear from kids who have already figured out how to not be a burden. Jake's first instinct was to shrug. He'd been asked that before, "Excuse me, can I?" usually followed by a sales pitch or a scam or a story that used the word sudden. But this kiddo, she didn't look like trouble. She looked like she'd been carved out of the same weary stone as the rest of the place. The diner hummed. The waitress was all chrome and tired smiles. Max looked up, eyebrows arched like he'd just found a new comic book character. Jake scanned the room, empty booths, a couple at the counter whispering, the TV blaring some late-night show. He had no cash to spare and three things on his mind: get back home, fix the heater, don't cry today. Then the kiddo smiled, this tiny, crooked smile that said she knew more about tough choices than most grown-ups gave her credit for. "Please," she said. Jake did something dumb and human. He patted the seat. "Have a seat, kid. Don't be shy." No heroics, no sermon, just an offered chair. She slid in like she belonged there, like she'd done it 1,000,000 times in her head. That's when the air changed, the kind of shift where you can feel that the night's about to bend. Max, mid-doodle, whispered, "Mom," like it was a code. Jake didn't have a script on how to handle unexpected guests. He'd been winging fatherhood since day one. The kids started talking, soft and quick, about a scholarship, a bus to catch, a place to stay. She had a way of explaining things that made the diner listen. And then she asked for something Jake didn't expect. Not money, not a favor. She asked for a story. That was the part where the night stepped off the sidewalk and into something else. Jake could tell there was a twist brewing, something that would change the way all three of them saw that drenched, neon-lit evening. She leaned forward, voice barely above the hum of the fridge, and said, "You ever wish someone would just listen?" And Jake's heart did a weird little skip. Wait till you hear what she says next. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and return to our channel for more life-changing, emotional, and heartwarming stories. Jake swallowed and nodded like he'd swallowed a lot in the past few years. Listening had become a survival skill, the kind that keeps you from sounding cracked when your kid asks why you can't buy him a winter coat. The girl, whose name turned out to be Leela, had this air of someone who'd learned to trade stories for safety. She started slow, telling a little about how she came to town. City lights cut off mid-blink, a foster system that promised one thing and gave another, and a single, stubborn dream to get into a trade school. As she talked, Jake found himself loosening. There's something about hearing a kid with grit speak that pulls you out of your own head. Max wriggled closer like he'd discovered a new TV show. Leela had a laugh, small, surprising, and it made the whole diner feel like someone had turned up the volume on hope. But it wasn't sunshine. Midway through, Leela dropped something heavy. A name, Maya. A mother who left with promises and came back like an unpaid bill. Jake's jaw tightened because he knew that look. It was the look of someone who'd been let down by the people supposed to hold them together. He thought of his own ex, and the years of midnight duty calls, and the nights when he'd driven the same beat of pavement just to let the world know he was still showing up. They swapped small confessions, the kind adults never say out loud. Jake admitted he'd lost his last job because the boss needed someone more reliable. Leela admitted the prosthetic she needed now would cost more than she could pull together by scrounging spare change. The waitress name tag said Rita slid in with refills and a sympathetic look that said, "We see you." At one point, Leela reached into her backpack and pulled out a crumpled envelope. Inside, a single photograph of a woman in a sundress, laughing, with an arm around a younger Leela. "She used to tell me I was her little firecracker," Leela said, eyes soft. "Then she left." The picture looked like proof that someone somewhere once loved her, a painful relic. Jake's chest ached. He wanted to give Leela something more than pity. He wanted to hand over his wallet and fix everything like a handyman with a toolkit for broken hearts. But he only had two things: a willingness to listen and a promise he'd made to Max that they'd try to get their lives right. He looked down at Max, who was doodling a little person with a cape, and thought of what it meant to be a dad, to hold the line even when the house was on shaky foundations. Then Leela said something that stopped the whole diner in its tracks. "I was told once that if I can make one person smile each day, that's enough to keep me going." The words were small but steady, like planks across a flooded street. Jake felt that. He realized he wanted to be the kind of man who kept someone else's promise when their keeper had walked out. Just as Jake reached for his wallet, the diner door slammed and a man they all knew too well stepped in, and he was holding a letter with Jake's name on it. "You won't believe who it's from." The man who walked in had a coat that had seen better years and a face like a ledger. Lined, practical, and capable of hiding a world of small cruelties. He tossed a damp envelope onto the counter, and the waitress handed it to Jake like a delivery of bad news. The envelope wasn't just any envelope. It had the courthouse stamp on it, the kind of official that makes your stomach do somersaults. Jake's name on the front felt like a verdict. He frowned, tore it open, and read, "Eviction notice." The kind of crisp paper that tells you you have exactly 30 days to gather the life you think you own and shove it into boxes. The diner hummed again, but this time it was a different kind of noise. The one that follows a man who realizes the floor beneath him is giving way. Leela watched with careful eyes, like she was tallying whether Jake had enough left to stand. Max grabbed his dad's hand and squeezed, a tiny anchor. Jake had choices. He could fold, hand over the keys to somewhere he'd spent half his paycheck, or he could fight like a stubborn weed cracking sidewalk. Without thinking, Jake pulled out his phone and called the landlord. Words were brittle over the line. "I can pay something," he said, which in landlord language can sound like a joke. The landlord offered him a payment plan that might as well have been a laugh track. Jake hung up, jaw tight. This wasn't the first time life had tried to push him sideways, but the timing was brutal. Max was due for dental work, the truck needed a new alternator, and somewhere between the bills and the job apps, Jake's patience had been spent. Leela leaned in. "Maybe we can help," she said. Not with cash, she didn't have that, but with a plan. She pulled up a notepad and rattled off a list. Community clinic for Max's tooth, a job fair downtown, a trade school scholarship she'd heard about through a counselor. The girl had the kind of resourcefulness that makes you resent her a little because she was so practical in a way adults forget to be. Jake stared. Somehow, a kid with one leg had mapped his life better than he had in months. He felt both grateful and exposed, grateful someone cared, exposed because he'd let things slide. The waitress set down a cup of coffee that tasted like a hug. Rita said, "We'll pitch in. Not much, but we'll try." Small towns, even small corners of a city work like that. Everyone's pockets are thin, but the human part of them is surprisingly deep. They plotted. Max would help with odd jobs. Jake would take the job fair and put on his best face. Leela would apply for every program and see if the universe had any mercy left. For a moment, the future looked like a map instead of a void. They all agreed on a plan, and then Leela dropped the bomb. She knew the landlord. She knew something else that made Jake freeze cold. She said, "He's not asking for money. He's asking for a favor, and it's about your past." What the heck did she mean? Jake's muscles locked. His past, the one he'd tried to keep buried beneath overtime and quiet apologies, wasn't something he wanted dug up. He'd done things young men do when they're desperate. Promises cut too close, shortcuts, a night that ended in regret. He'd been trying to stay on the straight and narrow, but the world likes to test resolve. And apparently the landlord liked to play with people's histories. Leela explained, voice low, "I overheard him at the shelter. He said he'd make exceptions for people who helped his business." Her eyes were steady, not accusatory. Jake felt cold because he knew which business she meant. The small-time hustles that let the rich keep their fancy couches and keep you owing favors you don't want to accept. Rita, the waitress, muttered under her breath and slid a napkin across the counter with a sketch of the landlord's office. A back entrance, a guard who showed up on Fridays, a file cabinet labeled discretion. The details were petty and precise, like the town itself had fingerprints. Jake's first reflex was to say no. He would not be pulled into another mess because of some guy's ledger. But then he looked at Max. The kid's face was open, like a window with no curtains. He'd been doing okay lately, really okay, and Jake wanted to keep it that way. He also owed it to himself to not run from every shadow. They hatched a plan, small, careful, and morally gray. Leela would apply pressure from the outside, file an anonymous complaint about the building code violations, alert a community lawyer. Jake would go to the job fair and keep his head down. Max would be Max, hyperactive, hopeful, and ready to help. They'd take the path of least harm while still standing their ground, the kind of plan you make when you have to be clever with nothing but grit. The next morning, Jake put on his only clean shirt, the one without a rip at the collar, and took Max to the community center. Leela met him there, dragging a little cart of flyers for a fundraiser she'd convinced a local church to host. The city smelled like fresh pavement and second chances. Jake found himself, unexpectedly, impressed with this kid who'd practically stitched a community strategy while still wearing scuffed sneakers. At the job fair, Jake shook a lot of hands and lied about things he'd fixed with his bare hands. "I can patch a roof," he told one recruiter. "I can keep a place warm." He didn't mention the eviction or the past or the way the landlord kept his eyes on people like they were numbers. He kept it simple, like a man who'd been practicing truth in small doses. But the landlord had a surprise of his own. That afternoon, a car pulled up to the diner with someone nobody expected. And when the person stepped out, Max recognized them. "Dad," he blurted. The name landed like a grenade. Who was this man? The man who stepped out of the car wore a suit that looked bought on a business trip and regret. He moved like someone used to commanding rooms, not diners. Max's voice, "Dad," hung awkwardly between a question and a prayer. The man wasn't Max's father. He was someone else. an old friend of Jake's whose life had shot off in a different direction years ago. He'd been the kind of person you cross paths with once, and then the world cleaves the memory in two. Jake's heart thudded. The man, Miguel, had history with him. College days, late nights, bad decisions whispered over cheap beer. Miguel had left town with a head full of plans and a suitcase of promises he never intended to keep. Now he had a smile that didn't reach his eyes and a name tag that said, Investor. He sauntered like someone checking his map for the treasure. Miguel slid into the booth like he owned the place. He was the kind of guy who could make complicated problems sound like opportunities to the gullible. He was also the kind of man who, 20 years ago, had made a choice that cost Jake a lot, a choice Jake had been trying to forget. Jake watched him like you watch a storm cloud move across a playground, wary, waiting for the thunder. Miguel wasn't there for small talk. He had deals. He mentioned properties, renovations, a plan to buy up slumping buildings and turn them into luxury rentals. He asked about Jake's place like a real estate agent checking under a rug for loose coins. His tone was slick and precise. "We're cleaning up the neighborhood," he said, which in Miguel speak meant buy low, flip high, and drop the other people out. Jake kept his face even, like a poker player with a trash hand. Miguel circled the idea of eviction casually, almost helpful. "We'll work with you," the kind of line that means you will do what we say. But then Miguel cocked his head and looked at Leela. Recognition flickered across his face. "Aren't you the kid from the shelter?" he asked. Leela stiffened, and the diner felt the size of a matchbox. Miguel's interest shifted. He wasn't stopping at property. He was hunting people whose pasts could be useful, people who might sign away rights and sign back favors without realizing they'd done it. He suggested an arrangement. "Help us test a new tenant screening program, and we'll fast-track your paperwork." It was bait. Jake felt the trap closing. Max, sensing the tension, dug into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled action figure. He didn't understand the negotiations, but he understood fear in his father's jaw. Jake swallowed hard and realized he had two choices: take Miguel's deal and trade his dignity for a roof, or refuse and risk the kids losing their home. Right when Jake mouthed, "No," Leela spoke up, and what she said made Miguel laugh in a way that chilled Jake to the bone. She called him by a name that didn't belong to him and told a secret that made the whole diner fall silent. What the heck did she know? Leela's voice was steady enough to echo. "You used to call yourself Mr. Bright at the shelter," she said. "You signed autographs for kids like you were some kind of hero." Her words landed like stones in a pond. Miguel's smile crumpled. He told stories when he was younger, promises of scholarships, business ventures for the underserved. People listened because he could speak silver into a room. But the story Leela told wasn't silver. It was a patchwork of lies and unpaid favors and a kid who left with more than a suitcase. He left with a reputation. Miguel tried to laugh it off. "You're talking nonsense," he said, but the laugh sounded thin. The waitress put down a cup a little too hard. Some of the regulars who'd known Miguel years ago exchanged looks. Leela kept pushing calmly. She had receipts. A photo here, a pamphlet there, a social post that linked Miguel to a collapsed shelter project from years back. People started to murmur because in small towns, receipts matter. Jake watched as Miguel's posture shifted from confident to defensive. It was like watching a wizard lose his hat. The man's deal evaporated in front of everyone because now the risk of associating with him was higher than letting Jake breathe. Miguel, who'd thought he could buy goodwill like a round of drinks, suddenly had fewer folks willing to shake his hand. What Leela did next surprised Jake. She offered a compromise. Instead of taking his money, she suggested Miguel actually help. fix the building's violations, and put in a legal rental agreement that protected existing tenants. Her tone was practical, not vindictive. She wanted people to be safe, not hurt. For a second, the whole place held its breath. Miguel's face hardened. Pride fought with greed. He made a motion toward the door like a man about to storm out, but then paused and said, "Fine, I'll think about it." He left with a swagger that didn't belong to his shoulders. The diner exhaled. Jake felt a strange mix of relief and unease. Leela had pulled something off that could have ended ugly. She'd used truth as leverage, a risky, beautiful kind of power. Jake was grateful and also aware that meddling with people's pasts can blow back. He watched Miguel's car disappear into the rain and felt a spark of something like hope. Maybe they'd get to keep the place. Maybe the landlord would blink. Rita came over, slipping a warm slice of pie onto the table like a consolation prize. "Family pays it forward," she said. The little community rallied in small ways. Max scored an after-school tutor. Jake got contacted about a part-time maintenance gig. And Leela's scholarship application moved forward a notch because a counselor at the center recognized her name from a grant list. Later that night, Jake found an envelope taped under his door. Inside was a single key and a note that said, "You can keep the place if you can help me with something." No signature, just a promise and a problem. Who left the key, and what did they want in return? A single key is a strange thing to find on your mat. It's a small object that carries a weight heavier than gold. Jake turned it over in his hand like he was reading an old coin, the metal cool and unassuming. The note, "You can keep the place if you can help me with something," had no name, no inked threat, just a request buried in ambiguity. Help with what? That was the problem. The past, it turns out, always wants something back. Jake showed the key to Leela and Max the next morning. Max treated it like a treasure. Leela treated it like a clue. They brainstormed. Maybe the landlord had a change of heart. Maybe someone wanted Jake to do a favor for a neighbor. They even joked about secret societies, which made Max laugh like the world hadn't been heavy for a minute. But that afternoon, Rita the waitress pulled Jake aside. "You ever hear of the old warehouse on 5th?" she asked. Jake shook his head. Rita whispered that the place used to belong to a man who did shady renovations and had a lot of unpaid labor. People who worked for him sometimes vanished from the payroll and reappeared later with fewer teeth and worse stories. The key, Rita suggested softly, might be a message. "You're in, but expect strings." Jake's stomach did a cartwheel. He'd been offered many things in life, chances, deals, second acts, and most of them required something you couldn't name. He thought of Max needing a school uniform and a dentist appointment. He thought of Leela's prosthetic. He thought of all the little promises he'd made that were still unpaid. Then he made a choice that felt like stepping off a curb. He went to the warehouse. The place smelled like old paint and lost wages. Inside, there were rooms with peeling wallpaper, a back office with a ledger, and a man hunched over a desk like he was playing a losing hand. He introduced himself as Tom, and his eyes were tired in that particular way that comes from watching a plan fail. He told Jake that Miguel had sold the building and left some unfinished business, a crew that needed a foreman for a gut job on the 3rd floor. The pay was enough to cover 2 months of rent, but it came with caveats. Odd hours, men who didn't ask questions, and a list of names Jake recognized from the outskirts of town. Jake could say no. He could walk away. He didn't. He took the job, not because he wanted to, but because men who worry about keeping roofs over their kids' heads rarely have the luxury of moral clarity. On his first night at the warehouse, a truck pulled up and unloaded a crate with a label Jake did not expect to see. It had a logo from a company he thought had gone bankrupt years ago, and inside the crate was something illegal. What would he do? Jake stood by the crate like a man at a crossroads. The logo on the box was from a defense contractor that'd been in the papers ages ago for shady contracts. He felt his world shrink down to the width of a single choice. Call it in and risk losing everything, or stay silent and sell his soul for a few months' worth of rent. Max's face popped into his mind, crooked grin, missing a front tooth in a way that made him twice as adorable. Leela's pried open a box of courage that had been tucked away for years. Jake thought of his boy's future more than he thought of himself. He did something quiet and unexpected. He opened the crate. Inside weren't weapons, at least not in the way headlines scream. Instead, there were prototype parts, things that could be used for legitimate manufacturing, and also the kind of parts that, in the wrong hands, could be repurposed. The line between legal and illegal was paper thin, and guilt can be a slow-burning thing. Tom, the man who'd hired him, watched with a patience that meant he'd been in this business too long to be surprised. Jake made a call. He dialed the number of a counselor at the community center who'd been helping Leela with scholarships. Then he dialed the number for an old buddy who'd become a small-time reporter. He put the parts in a lockbox at the center and told Rita he'd need to sleep at the diner for a couple of nights. The sensible thing would have been to keep quiet and fix his problems with cash. The better thing would be to report it and step into a messy fight. The morning the story broke, the town did what small towns do, it roused itself. Miguel disappeared. Tom was picked up by folks who'd been tracking shipments. The landlord got fined for building violations. Jake's eviction notice was paused while an investigation sorted out who'd been compromised. Leela got a scholarship interview because people suddenly noticed the kid who'd organized neighbors. Rita got a small crowdfunding page. Max got a new winter jacket from someone who'd read the article and decided to help. Jake didn't become a saint. He still had bills and dents in his chest. But something shifted. People started showing up in ways that weren't transactional. They brought casseroles, offered babysitting, and asked to borrow a tool. The diner became a hub for folks trying to make things right. At the end, Jake sat with Leela and Max under the same flickering neon light where it all began. They ate slice of pie, laughed stupidly loud, and planned the next move. The city was the same city, rain, neon, and the occasional jerk in a suit, but it felt a little less sharp. As Jake tucked Max in that night, the boy said, "Dad, do you think heroes come in booths?" Jake smiled, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "Maybe. Or maybe heroes just show up when things get ugly." Outside, a car idled, and a shadow in the passenger seat slid something across the seat, a little envelope with a note. "Thanks." No name, no return address, just gratitude. The question hung in the air. Who else was watching?